Hello, my name is Luka Nachkebia. I'm a chef from Georgia, and I'm really happy to be part of this project that is organized by Writers House of Georgia. And today we're doing some kind of a continuation of whatever we started in 2018 in Frankfurt Buchmesse. And I'm going to introduce you to a Georgian dish that is called Khinkali, which is one of those dishes I think that everybody should know around the world because it's one of the most important and most delicate parts of Georgian cuisine and general culinary culture. And I'm going to go straight to the point and start cooking and introduce you to the culture of Khinkali slowly but surely. First of all, what we should do is describe what is Khinkali. And Khinkali is a type of dumpling. And since it's a dumpling, and I think it's one of the best dumplings in the world, I'm going to start preparing the dough. We will need some white flour, preferably any all-purpose flour or flour that is good for baking bread. Not too much gluten and not too much ash, but well balanced. And for every 400 grams of flour, we will need 130, 140 grams of water. The dough should be tough. And this is one of these traditional Georgian dishes that's been around for several centuries and before the occupation of 1921. And it was even mentioned by Suhan Sabaw-Berliani, one of the oldest mentioned dishes in Georgian history that is still mostly unchanged over time. But definitely, like most great dishes, it has evolved, become better, more flavorful and tastier. And Khinkali is one of those dishes that is most definitely easily adapted towards the whole world. It is made with different kind of stuffings. Over the years, the stuffings have changed. Originally, it was mostly either lamb or pork. And slowly beef was introduced to it, then maybe mushrooms, even cheese, potatoes. It's dumplings, so like most dumplings around the world, we share the culture of interchanging stuffings. The dough should be elastic and well rested, but really, really tough. This dish is one of those dishes that is basically spread around all around the Georgia and with different varieties. And in mountainous regions, it's usually less herbs and more spices in the stuffing, and the dough itself is tougher and made with flour that is grayer, less pure, and mostly has a bit more ash, and the stuffing itself is less juicy. But in the lower parts of the country, in central Georgia, the traditional form is extra juicy with white flour, white dough, and this makes this dish perfect dish for basically any kind of beer event. Wherever is beer, Khinkali is always almost present. And when is the better time than European Championship? So basically, if there's anybody who's watching football, I recommend doing this recipe, trying it out, and enjoying beer and Khinkali together, and watching Germany beat Hungary preferably, or someone else later. If they beat Hungary, which they surely will. I hope so. The main goal is to prepare a dough that is uniform, tough, and usually it takes up to 10 or 15 minutes of kneading. And if you have a dough mixer, a hook or something, it won't work because there's not really a lot of home appliances that can handle the toughness of this dough. So by hand it is. Like most of the Asian dumplings, it does need a bit of human power to put together. That's why I'm sweating right now, and that's why I'm out of my breath. Okay, as soon as it's mostly uniform, what you can do is you can just wrap it in a cling wrap and put it in the fridge so that it kind of rests and becomes even more uniform, and then you can redo the process again and make it even more elastic. I'm going to let this rest now. In reality, I have a dough prepared beforehand, which has been resting in the fridge for several hours now. So I'm going to use that one because it needs at least like an hour of resting for it to become as flavorful and as elastic as we need. Because water does activate the flavors in gluten and in flour altogether, so that's an integral part of Khinkali, because the flavor of the Khinkali is not only the meats and the spices that goes in the stuffing, but also the flour that you're using. It mixes well together and gives you a nice broth inside the dumpling. When it comes to stuffing Khinkali, this is where usually the magic happens. I've prepared in advance 2 types of mince. Here we have pork belly, which in Georgia is called umzeuri, as it translates into a part that never sees the sun, so it's the belly part of the pig. And we're also using beef shoulder, which is a very flavorful, fatty part of a beef. Beef shoulder and pork together give us the best variety of broth. But there's different varieties. There might be only pork, only beef, but usually the fat part is the important part. The fattier, the better. Right now what I'm doing is using 2 types of meat with a ratio of 1:1. So here's beef, and that's not enough. To get the flavorful broth, you also need onions. And usually the ratio of onions to meat is 1:3. So 1 part onions and 3 parts of meat. And again, usually in mountainous regions of Georgia, onions are minced together with the meat. And they're not really minced by a machine or anything. They're usually minced with either a knife or something like a machete or an axe, or as the traditional way goes, with a sword. So they usually take a piece of wood, a thick one, just lay the meat on it and just chop it as much as they can. And what it does, it gives you juicier mince. But the juiciness is usually guaranteed by a different part of the recipe, which I'll show you. When it comes to onions, just do as fine as you can. But the interesting part is that it shouldn't be pureed. It's always better if you feel patches of onion and crunches of onion inside the thick mince in the stuffing. There's one thing that Georgians always mess up when they make khinkali. Not always, but sometimes mess up when they make khinkali. That's that they use garlic, and garlic is one of those ingredients that should never go into khinkali, even though some might disagree. The traditional recipes never mentioned any kinds of garlic, so it's mostly onions. One of the top tips for actually tasting khinkali and eating khinkali is that, of course, there are many restaurants in Georgia that serve great khinkali. But if you're ever in doubt which khinkali to eat, which kind of khinkali to eat, so the mountain region type without herbs or one with the herbs, if you have doubt that the restaurant serves really good khinkali, always go for the one with the herbs, because the one with the herbs usually has better flavor, because it's easier to turn into rich broth because it has herbs, and it needs the least amount of fine-tuning to get a flavorful aroma. But if you know that the restaurant is really good at khinkali, always go for the one from the mountains, from tiuluri, because tiuluri is the authentic form, and if the meat is the best quality, and if the onions are great, and if the water ratio to the spices is great, then you get the best kind of experience. So this tip was discovered by me and my friend, who kept ordering. Anytime we went to a restaurant that serves khinkali, she kept ordering one with the herbs, and always her choice was the better flavored, because most restaurants didn't really handle khinkali well. And so then we went on a small bar hopping kind of event, but it was khinkali hopping basically, and we tried different kind of khinkali during a day. And yes, the best one was one without the herbs, but usually the above average ones were the one with the herbs, and the really bad ones were one without the herbs. So the experiments showed us that in most restaurants handle one with the herbs better than one without. So again, if you're sure about the quality of a restaurant, go for the one with other herbs. But if it's just a random restaurant that also serves some kind of other food except Georgian, go with the one with the herbs. Okay, since now we have our onions and meats inside the bowl, now it's time to prepare the spices. And also one of the original recipes of khinkali usually only called for 3 ingredients. It was onions, it was chilies, and black pepper. and salt, of course. But then whenever they came in doubts of beef being the best quality and the best flavored one, they would usually add either caraway or type of Georgian cumin to flavor it even further and cover the less good parts of the flavors from the meat, which was not the best quality. Of course, now all the meat is good quality and it's easier, but this tradition stayed over, so caraway and cumin are mainstays in the recipe. So seeds of caraway or cumin, but Georgian cumin is a bit more different flavored than the other ones, so if you're doing this in Germany, go for the caraway seeds. A teaspoon of black pepper, which is also usually a classical topping for the dish, and mash it. Of course, it's always easier to get the powder, but if you want to get the best aromas, of course, every single time go for the seeds. Having a mortar and a pestle in the kitchen is one of the most important parts. One of the interesting differences in the cultures of culinary cultures, almost every family in Georgia has a meat mincer, which is not as common in Europe. It's usually more common that people just go to a butcher shop and mince meat there. But in Georgia, people like to mince meat a lot, so most every single family has a type of a meat mincer there at home. So just make sure this is really, really well ground. And yes, this is tasking. To get the best flavors, it's usually, you need to break some sweat. Now, chilies. A huge pinch. And keep on grinding. Usually having khinkali being really, really hot and spicy is not a thing to do. Not the best choice. But the region I'm from Georgia, San Miguel is notable for spicy food, so I keep on adding inadequate amounts of chilies to everything. I'm going to do the same to khinkali, which is kind of blasphemous, but let's be honest, it improves the flavor. So gloves, first of all, combine the onions with the mince. And try to be as aggressive as possible with the meat, so you kind of mash the onion juice into the meat. Most restaurants in Georgia prefer the ratio of 30% pork to 70% of beef, but the best khinkali I've usually tasted is either only pork or just 1-to-1 ratio, but that is also just subjective as hell, because there are as many different varieties of opinions about khinkali in Georgia as there are recipes and humans in Georgia, so everybody has their own version of khinkali that is best. This is just one of the versions that is best for me. But to be honest, if you want to have the prime experience of khinkali, it should be all three meats. Like, it should be beef, pork, and lamb, and 40% of beef, 30 pork, 30 lamb is the best combo ever. But usually not everybody likes the smell and the flavor of lamb in Georgia, because Georgian lamb is a bit more intense in flavor than the ones usually on the market around the world. So usually most of the people around here right now who are in our group Chef Cave prefer ones without the lamb, at least ones that are not chefs or cooks, because every single cook I think likes lamb, but not producers or directors or sound editors here. So there we go. First of all, before you do the spices, you salt. You salt the dish, and the usual ratio is 1.2 to 1.5% of salt to meat ratio. This dish is one of the best known ones for one particular reason. If you had a heavy night of drinking and you want to go to sleep without having a hangover the next day, what you do is either you eat khinkali before you go to sleep, which is probably a bit too tasking for the stomach, or what you do is a traditional time and tested tried tradition of Georgian cuisine is just wake up in the morning and go for a khinkali at 12 p.m., which is I think something that every Georgian has experienced, and if they have not, I think they really truly do not qualify as Georgians. Probably, I don't know. Like Georgians are born with a glass of wine in their hand and Khinkali in the other one, so that's usually how it works. Okay, now spices. And do not overspice. Usually for almost 1.5 kilos of mince, 1 tablespoon of spices is more than enough. The main flavor should always be meat, onions, and the broth itself that is created from those two things. And the saltiness, of course. And now comes the most integral part of Khinkali stuffing, which is adding water or broth to the mince. So the whole idea is that for Khinkali to be as juicy as possible, the mince should be basically a liquid. And now what we have here is some beef broth. It could be water or beef broth, doesn't really matter if you don't want to get the best flavor. If you want to get the best flavor, you usually use beef broth. Make sure it's not too salty so that you don't oversalt the mince. And you can watch how much of the broth is incorporated into the mince. And basically, one of the top skills that a Khinkali cook should have is just the ability to wrap a Khinkali with as much as water as possible in the mince. It usually makes the job harder and gives you less time to cook the Khinkali because the wetness of the mince usually dampens the dough when you're rolling it and when you're tying it. So it gives you less time to actually start boiling it. So the know-how and the technique hides in the amount of water that is in the mince. And one of the ways to double check the right amount of water in the mince is to take a tablespoon, just place it into the mince and push it down a bit. And if the water starts running into the tablespoon, then it has the right amount of water. And you can see that it's not doing it, so it means it can take even more broth. But this is the best time to double check if there's enough spices. So you smell it and smell the spices. If you don't, you add the spices. I said the word spices too many times already, I think. A bit more. A bit of black pepper as well. A bit more chilies. Clove. And more broth. So the more pork it has, the more water it will absorb. Because pork in this case has more fat and lets the mince engulf more water without releasing it because it plays the role of a barrier. But it's juicy enough. Maybe a bit more. There you go. Right now, the mince is perfect. So, let this rest. Just set it in the fridge for at least 20 minutes before we roll the dough, and then we stuff it. Now for the TV magic, we've prepared the dough in advance, so I have several pieces here. And this part is not necessarily the most fun part, but is an important part. What we need to do is we have to make dough discs. So that in those dough discs we put in the mince that's in the fridge, and then we tie it. And there's a very special way of tying it, which has its own semi-religious cultural symbolism, full of legends and myths. So let's begin. What you need is either you flatten the dough all together and then you cut out the forms, or you just make discs like this and then you flatten those. Usually in the restaurants they don't do it this way because it usually takes more time and is not as efficient. But at home this is the way to go because it's just basically easier. And make sure the dough doesn't dry out. So what you do is you cover it with cling wrap. you start with a single piece. I'm going to show you how to make it. And you just basically repeat the process over and over again. Bit of flour. And this part is similar to most of the dumplings around the world. Make a thin disc. The tougher the dough, the more stable it will be during the boiling. And one of the myths surrounding this shape form is that in physics, the higher the altitude, the lower the pressure. So basically, water boils on a lower temperature than on a higher pressure surrounding. So basically, if you're in, for example, Berlin or Munich, water will boil on a higher temperature than in, for example, somewhere in the Alps. So what this does is you create basically a chamber, high pressure chamber when you tie this, and it lets the boiling temperature rise, so the water actually inside the khinkali doesn't boil at 100 degrees, it boils at 101 or 102, which creates even better flavor. So it's basically like a pressure cooker. One, flour it, then the second one. And usually in restaurants, when this dish is prepared, it's several people working on it, even though there are some new technologies that make these things easier, rolling pins, automated ones and everything. The traditional way is just several people, several cooks sitting around the table and just like a human conveyor belt basically creating hundreds and hundreds of khinkalis. And the khinkali basically is one of the coolest dishes in my opinion because it has so much mythos and methodology around it that eating it, even eating and preparing it is really fun. So for example, the specific ways of eating it there's some rules to eating it basically. And one of the rules is that it shouldn't tear while being eaten and the juice from the khinkali shouldn't pour over onto the plate, and you should never use a fork or a spoon or anything. So there's like several rules, and I've seen people get scolded on a Georgian feast just because of eating khinkali with a wrong utensil or without their hands or just not finishing it or just adding anything to it. The only ingredient that you can actually add to khinkali is pepper, black pepper, which I also think is wrong. But some people think it's right, so let them eat it with black pepper. But then there's another category of people who add some vinegar to it, and those people go to same hell as people who talk in the theater or basically burn books. So there's basically khinkali has lots of traditions, and that's why it's one of the coolest dishes around, I think. Even some of my friends eat khinkali with vinegar. And yeah, it's like a good addition of sourness if you're hungover, because khinkali is like probably number one hangover dish in the world. I'd say it's even better than ramen or, I don't know, most of the soups around the world. But again, rules are rules, and they've been around for several hundred years in Georgia. And I'd say if there are any Georgian rules you have to obey, is the right way of eating khinkali is one of the most important ones. Just because it's really, really fun. And it just gives you the best flavor. Okay, so now since the water is boiling, and you always need a big pot, this is not the biggest one we have, but we're not going to boil more than 4 together. You add a fistful of salt to it. You basically use the same amount of salt you would use for a pasta, maybe a bit more. And now what we do is we add mince to the dough and tie the khinkali. You can see here how much water the mince has. You have to incorporate the water back into the meat so it's not too apart. What you do is you take the piece of dough, take a spoonful of mince and put it in the middle. And then you tie it. And the most important part is you have to fold. And you fold the same way you would fold a letter, basically. And every next one should be a bit after the previous one. And you go around and just pinch it. And you just cut off the top, and there you go, the khinkali is done. And you make sure that you use some flour underneath so it doesn't leak any juices. And when it comes to folding khinkali, there are different kinds of opinions. Some say there should be 18 folds, some say there should be 21 folds. I've heard even 17 folds. Some have said that 9 folds are enough. There's basically different opinions about it. I think as many opinions as there are regions that are native to khinkali. But basically, as many folds you can do is good. Any leftover dough is usually collected. You add some dampness to it, maybe wet hand, and just re-roll it again, and you can make more khinkali from this. So there's 4 of us here, and I'm not going to overcrowd the pan, so I'm going to just boil 4. Usually make sure that you have at least 20 times more water in mass than you have khinkali. So if you're doing a kilo of khinkali, have 20 liters of water in a pot so that it boils fast and evenly. Spin the water so you have a current, and dropping the khinkalis so that they don't stick. Every culinary culture has their own rules, basically, and some things they agree on. And I think one of the things that the Georgian culture has agreed, all of us chefs have agreed, that one of those dishes that does not really need any tempering or any manipulations on a nationwide level is khinkali. You don't really need to improve anything, basically just improve ingredients. And we tend to avoid changing khinkali too much. And if we do, we try to basically just promote variety that is logical. So the most important parts of khinkali are always the broth, the brothiness, the heartiness, basically, and the comfort. So we try to avoid gourmet types of khinkali that have basically ingredients that are too posh or too expensive. Because one of the things that khinkali has in the culture that is very essential to its sense is that it's cheap, and you usually eat several of these. So basically, it's food for the people. So sooner or later, khinkalis are going to start floating and expanding. At this point, there's a risk of it bursting, so you have to be attentive. And it's really important so that you don't take it out of the pot right away while it's expanded and bloated, because the change in pressure is going to burst it. So one of the traditional things Georgians do is just you shower it with cold water so it cools down, deflates, and then you take it out. You chill it down. And take it out. Okay. So place it upside down. Classical topping, as I said, is pepper. I'm going to pepper yours, but I'm not going to pepper mine. And also, khinkali has this wonderful tradition when you cook it, eat it, and there's some left over. The leftover khinkali, which is already boiled, is usually fried. And I'd say that's one of the most magical after parties on any feast in the world, when the main event, usually, which is khinkali, turns into a side event or after party event, which basically is really sought after, but it's never, almost never usually made as a main event. So I'd like you guys here who are shooting this video to try khinkali, because any khinkali that is not eaten is a khinkali lost and not valued. I'm going to start with the first one. Okay. So, okay. So, meanwhile, while our friends here are eating, I hope you can see the face of this person here who's enjoying Khinkali, and that's usually the face you have to get, like you're hearing a pièce, like you're hearing an opera, you know, like it's Pavarotti who's singing, or I don't know, Wagner playing, I don't know, something like that. Basically, if you have the same emotions towards food as you have towards Richard Wagner, for example, then you did the Khinkali right, and you did the Khinkali justice, basically. So remember, if the Khinkali doesn't make you make this face, then the Khinkali wasn't the right kind of Khinkali. So, you like it? Nice. So, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you're going to try this at home. It's one of the easiest dishes. I didn't want to complicate it any further because I want this dish to be international, and I want everybody to be able to enjoy this experience because it is hands down one of the most complete and perfect dishes anywhere in this world. And I hope all the cultures will adopt it. And I think this fits perfectly for a German flavor profile because we here like German food a lot, so I assume the Germans also would like Georgian food because since we enjoy your flavors, I'd say some of the flavors are similar. So yeah, give it a try, and actually, if you try it, write us on Chef Cave on Instagram and just tell us about your feelings towards Khinkali. We'd love to hear it. And have a great day. Thanks.